Thanks so much. And unlike our two wonderfully eloquent speakers, I'm going to read. And partly I'm going to read because I don't trust myself to actually do this in 20 minutes. As soon as slides get up there, I start talking for a long time. My paper is conceptual, so I'm a political philosopher. I tag that tag. And I'm kind of interested in conceptually exploring the problem of how do we provide different frameworks for thinking about the advocacy challenge in relation to fish. And this is part of the reason I became interested in resistance. I'd like to start with what I see as the tactical quandary facing animal advocates in relation to the question of fish welfare. In part, this situation is a result of a lack of agreement that fish are capable of suffering, or at least that this suffering matters. The uncertainty over whether fish feel pain within the scientific community, combined with a public attachment to the maintenance of existing fishing practices, produces a somewhat perverse silence in relation to fish welfare. For animal advocacy, at least when it comes to fish, the situation looks grim. The growing world per capita appetite for fish, the exponential expansion of industrial aquaculture, and limited public and scientific agreement on the question of fish suffering all suggest that fish welfare will continue to be a low priority in the face of a massive restructuring of global human consumption towards fish-based protein. It is with this in mind that this paper aims to explore alternative framings to think about advocacy on behalf of fish, and particularly framings that do not need to rely on suffering as a ground upon which to award welfare. Lots of framing of animal welfare and animal rights discourse is grounded in the innate capabilities of animals and their moral worth. My focus instead is on understanding the potential of the question, do fish resist? My interest in resistance is that it offers a different model for considering political agency that need not necessarily be grounded on an innate capability, such as suffering. When we think of resistance, we aren't initially concerned with recognising the moral worth of those who resist. We're instead interested, firstly, in how those who resist are involved in relationships of power. In a sense, there's a lot of potential for thinking about resistance, which might offer ways for advocates to shift some of the discourse that surrounds the use of fish for human consumption. The language used in policy and industry documentation frequently assumes that fish are passive entities incapable of resistance. We find this logic powerfully present in at least some of the official documents where fish are, as the official terminology used by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization states, simply, quote, harvested for human use from oceans, seas and rivers. This word harvest appears again and again within fishing literature to describe the act of taking fish from water. In these cases, we are presented with the idea of fish giving themselves passively, as it were, to us to be used, with fish exercising no particular preference as to whether they continue living or meet the end of their life at our hands. At least one reason resistance is a useful frame is that it offers us a construction of those who resist as not merely passive, unfeeling entities or victims subject to the suffering of those who dominate them, but as political agents who impose themselves, often inconveniently, upon the political ambitions of others. Perhaps one way to think about this is the infamous SeaWorld orca, Tilikum, who was the subject of the recent documentary, Blackfish. The strong public outrage that has occupied the headlines since the documentary attests to a different sort of animal politics than that of the conventional welfare narrative. There's no doubt that the public has been concerned about the suffering of Tilikum. However, arguably what has caught the attention of many has been the death of the 3 trainers, which have in many respects been understood by sections of the public quite unapologetically as the outcome of acts of resistance by Tilikum towards human domination. Along the lines of this understanding of resistance, there's been some interesting scholarly work within animal studies, perhaps the most prominently the work of Jason Hrebrul, which documents through historical case studies examples of animals breaking free from human control, breaking down fences, escaping abattoirs, tussling with human controllers, maiming those who stand in their way. In these cases, animal resistance is conceptualised as comprising intentional acts of insubordination against human domination. This model of resistance is potentially fraught when we consider fish, and perhaps for the same reason that the question of fish suffering is also fraught. Certainly one objection that might be raised is that there is no scientific evidence, in quotation marks, to suggest that fish, as intentional agents, work against human domination. That is, according to this argument, fish lack the reasoning or other agential capacity to choose to resist, and that any visible evidence of what might look like resistance, for example, fish struggling at the end of a fishing line, reflects instinctive rather than rational behaviour. It is certainly beyond the scope of this paper to advance an empirically grounded argument for fish agency in relation to this form of resistance. I'm certainly no scientist. However, there's a different way we might consider resistance. I name this approach the autonomous or operist account of resistance, which understands resistance as an organic process of conflict and development within the evolution of production systems. In understanding this model of resistance, I have been influenced by Italian Marxist scholars and by recent work of animal studies scholars such as Fahim Amir, Agnieszka Kowalczyk, and Nicole Shukin. In this view, systems of production and exchange feed upon the productive capacities, creativity, and resistance of the bodies that labour within these systems. For example, as political theorists such as Michael Hart and Antonio Negri have argued, the novel flexibilities in workplaces that characterise post-Fordist production that are around us all around, flexible working hours, work from home arrangements, teleworking, etc., are the result of capitalism adapting to the resistance of workers to Fordist modes of disciplined production. It is because workers in the 60s and 70s actively dropped out of labour through absenteeism, taking sick days, through cultural experimentation, through long toilet breaks and sabotage, that capitalism needed to adapt and remould to work itself in order to maintain production. In this argument, the flexible work arrangements we all now toil under, as academics you'll know, we never stop working, are directly a product of capitalism co-opting the resistance of workers in an earlier period. This seems very useful for thinking about animal resistance. The design of a production system or a piece of technology, for example, a stun gun in a slaughterhouse or a chicken shackle in a poultry production line, can tell us something about the essential role of animal resistance in informing the development of mechanisms of capture and utilisation. Importantly, this model of resistance is not agential in the classic liberal formulation. That is, it doesn't comprise individual, intentional acts of insubordination against human domination, but represents an evolving collective process of contestation and power. It also allows us to focus on technologies and production systems and understand the way that they themselves betray the trace of animal resistance in their design. It is only because animals resist, because they do not give themselves up to us without resistance, that these technologies exist and are refined in the way that they are. Building on this conceptualisation of resistance, I'd like to offer two examples, the hook and aquaculture. And there's more examples in a longer paper, but I'm going to start with these two. The hook is possibly one of the oldest human technological innovations for the capture of animal life. Some commentaries observe that the development of the hook and other fishing gears fundamentally shifted the nature of human hunting practice and human societies and opened the river, lake, sea and oceans as a commons for human pursuit of animal-based food. Forbes magazine recently listed the hook as one of the 20 most important tools ever invented. The hook would not be necessary if fish allowed themselves to be passively harvested. On the contrary, it is precisely because fish elude human capture that the hook was devised. The hook is an ingenious capture and kill device in this regard. It is a sharp point with a bend in it, which can be affixed to a line, allowing its operator to work at a distance. The bend is crucial insofar as the hook aims not merely to impale the victim, but to snag the body of the fish to the hook, allowing it to be drawn in by the line. The hook frequently works with a lure or bait. In these cases, the hook is a stealth device. It aims to deceive an animal who would evade capture by other means. The hook was thus fundamentally conceived to work against fish resistance to capture. When it finds sinuous flesh with which to bind itself to, the body of the fish is effectively turned against the self. The fish will struggle against their own mouth, or perhaps another place where the fish is hooked, the gut or the eye, which frequently happens. The technical innovation of the barb in the hook, there's a picture of the barb here, Is there a barb there? No, I haven't got a barb on one of the pictures. The barb in the hook, a counter-facing sharp extremity near the point, heightened the capacity of the hook as a technology to refuse resistance. The barb makes it more difficult for fish to free themselves once impaled. Freedom from the hook is only possible with further laceration. The discussions that are currently occurring within the recreational catch and release fishing community on whether barbless hooks should be used on ethical and sustainability grounds are interesting in this regard. Recreational fishing is fishing for sport. The sport in this case only comes about because recreational fishing derives its supposed pleasure from the resistance of fish to capture. Recreational fishing is not interested in merely impaling the fish, but the whole process of drawing in a struggling fish, and then if the animal survives, setting it free. And often fisher people will play the fish on the line to draw out this process. The barb in the hook offers an additional safeguard that the fish will not slip away once impaled. However, it risks further injury and death to the fish, particularly if the fish is impaled in the gut, working against the stated aim of recreational fishing to merely catch and return fish as sport. In some respects, it should come as no surprise that hook development can work to maximise resistance in order to enhance the sport of fishing, sport in inverted commas. For example, circle hooks, which is a picture of one up here, incorporate a wider curve to more efficiently facilitate sport fishing in some contexts, particularly by avoiding hooking the fish in the gut. One research circular from an organisation called Sea Grant, Florida, on the benefits of circle hooks explains, and I quote, "Fish hooked in the corner of the mouth or jaw tend to fight better than a fish that is hooked in the gut." Here, resistance itself, maximising the intensity of resistance, making it persist, is the objective of the productive activity of fishing. I'd like to now turn to think about aquaculture, the other side of the picture, if you like, the emergence of large-scale industrial fish farms. Commercial wild fishing is in some respects a form of hunting, and today operates as a peculiar industrialised form of mechanised predation. In this respect, commercial fishing is unlike any other large-scale form of animal utilisation for food by humans. However, as I've stated, there's been an extraordinary explosion in the development of aquaculture, at least over the last 20 years, which has substantially shifted the nature of large-scale fishing industries. In some respects, the development of aquaculture is itself a technological and practice response to fish resistance. We know that since the 1980s, the number of wild fish caught on a global level have more or less stayed the same. It is aquaculture that has filled the gap in terms of supplying the other fish that have been used on a global level for human consumption. On one hand, there's an environmental explanation for this. As experts have repeatedly warned, wild fishing is at capacity or being actively overexploited for many fish species. However, this assumes that fish are merely passive objects that must be found and, as the nomenclature assumes, harvested. A different way to conceptualise this is that the human technical means for capturing wild fish through mechanised hunting technologies have reached their limit. The economics are poor in terms of trying to hunt the remaining fish who currently evade capture, and due to these hunting activities, fish are not able to reproduce themselves in such a way as to be readily available to meet the growing human demand for fish food. Thus, more concentrated forms of utilisation, such as aquaculture, have become economically viable. In this sense, on a global scale, fish resistance has had a role to play in the development of aquaculture. Wild fish are not just scarce because humans cannot find them, they are scarce because they evade capture. Like other animals, fish have found ways to survive a hostile environment that includes, amongst its variables, human predation. Aquaculture solves this problem by domesticating fish into enclosed farms. Domestication is a solution to animal resistance that has been effectively applied to land animals over millennia. It is now being applied in earnest to fish. Aquaculture holds the promise of mitigating the effects of fish resistance on a day-to-day level through concentrated forms of control. This is because, like other factory farms, aquaculture provides operators the opportunity to exert birth-to-death controls in order to enable a more refined management over the final product. One aquaculture expert comments that, quote, "The entire life cycle has been rigorously controlled. We know where it was born, where it died, and what it ate through its entire life," end quote. A range of techniques are used that directly respond to fish resistance within the context of aquaculture. I don't have time to go through all of them, but let me just think about two. Consider current experiments on the use of lights in aquaculture pens to control behaviour. Some intensively farmed fish will exhibit fin damage as a result of interfish aggression and abrasion against surfaces, problems which may not occur in the wild. In some cases, this is a reflection of the relative stocking densities within aquaculture environments. The problem is exacerbated where fish congregate together and do not spread out evenly within the available space in sea cages, such as in the case of salmon. Various researchers have experimented with the use of underwater lamps to influence the behaviour of salmon and prevent congregation, thus helping to mitigate the problems associated with high density. Turn on the light and some fish will run away. They're aversive to light. This technique thus uses fish resistance and autonomy to prevent fish congregating and improve the quality of the meat that is produced. Another example is the routine use of starvation prior to transport and slaughter for farmed fish. In some cases, farmed fish are denied food for several days, or in the case of some species, several weeks prior to being slaughtered. Fish are ectothermic, and maybe Callum will explain this better than I would, and thus have metabolic efficiency in relation to food consumption. Many fish routinely starve in the wild for long periods without food. Aquaculture producers will make use of this in starvation techniques, reduce metabolism, and the fact that fish will empty their guts will enable a more desirable end product. Of course, the welfare picture here is far from straightforward. Some argue, for example, that the diminished metabolism induced by starvation is beneficial to welfare, for example, by reducing aggressive behaviours by fish and the capacity for them to injure themselves in the process of transport particularly. However, in these cases, we find again that the creative energies of fish, including their own resistance, at least at the level of their own will to survive, is captured by the production process and harnessed towards the ends of production. I would like to conclude with just a few short observations on the conceptualisation of fish resistance and the potential it has for thinking about how we might intervene in discussions on how we should treat fish. Firstly, I stress that I'm not arguing that we need to abandon a welfare approach to considering the treatment of fish. It's certainly worth noting that progress in relation to fish welfare has been relatively modest, but at the same time there has been minor progress. In principle, advocates for improving welfare for fish should be supportive of any reforms that will reduce the suffering experienced by fish as part and parcel of human utilisation. Questions around welfare arguably will become more vexing as consumption of fish sourced through aquaculture proportionally increases on a global scale, and this is partly because we have more capacity to control the welfare outcomes of fish. It is for the latter reason that I think that there is promise in exploring new ways to conceptualise the problem of human utilisation of animals and an urgent need to develop new framings. As I've argued, we can understand fish as subject to large-scale systems of violence and understand fish resistance to these same systems, and this gives us some different ways to imagine social justice for animals that goes beyond relief from suffering and towards relief from human-imposed violence. This perspective asks us to imagine fish as not merely beings who might suffer, but beings who would prefer not to be used and would prefer not to die. This is the essence of resistance. And beings who actively resist human attempts to bend them towards those ends. Adopting this sort of perspective offers us opportunities to at least shift some of the language that is commonplace in relation to fish and fisheries. For example, a different framing might allow us to be rid of the pernicious concept that fish are passive objects harvested from oceans and rivers. Finally, the model of resistance I've put forward, which understands fish resistance as a set of creative acts that are continually captured by human production systems, gives us a reminder of the dynamics of our relationships with fish. This model of resistance highlights that our main relationship with trillions of fish on the planet is largely parasitic. We quite literally, feed on their creative energies and build industries to respond to their resistance. Recognising fish resistance might give us a different way to think about how we might relate to fish beyond simply finding new ways to counter their resistance to us. Thank you.